Evening, everybody. I hope you've had a good Monday. Welcome along, Paranormal Monkey Podcast here again, and really, really pleased this one. We had a couple of weeks ago. We had a bit of a technical issue in that I think the storm kind of kicked out my internet, was having real issues, but thankfully, and basically had to cancel my guest, which is Amy Boucher, who we've got this evening. So really, really pleased to finally get Amy on. I'm sure she's really pleased to come on as well. Really, really, I mean, it's really, really fascinating person, and actually, it's to be honest, it's the content, her content, and her what she writes about for Haunted Magazine as well as other places is just fascinating. Mainly because a lot of what Amy talks about is about the folklore and ghosts linked to a very particular place in England called Shropshire. So, without further ado, I'm just going to bring on Amy. She can say hello to everybody, and we can get the ball rolling.
Hello.
Evening, Amy.
Hi, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, sorry about that kind of whole issue thing that we had, say, a couple of weeks ago. I was ready to go, and then just dead internet. So sorry about that. But hey, we're on now.
Yeah, glad to be here, and don't worry about it. I live in an old mill, and trying to get internet here at the best of times is awful. But in that storm, it was a bit touch and go here too.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm just really pleased because I've been wanting to you on for a little while, to be honest. Because obviously you write for Haunted Magazine. Every article you write has been fascinating, to be honest. And
Thank you.
actually, you're not just interested in ghosts, which is the main thing. It's all about the folklore of Shropshire, which I find really, really interesting because would you call yourself a folklorist? Because actually there's not many folklorists around that I would say.
I would probably use the term folklorist over other things because I'm not quite a historian. I did a history degree, but some of the stuff you can't say that some of my stories of the devil are history. And I wouldn't necessarily call myself like a content creator or anything like that. I use folklorist and writer because I think they're the two terms that probably best fit me other than goblin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, no, Goblin works well. It's good. It's good on Twitter. I will put on your Twitter handle, your username on Twitter as well on there, so we can kind of track you down on Twitter because you do post regularly about again all links to folklore stuff and things you've been investigating and researching, which we'll come on to in a sec.
Yes.
So before we go any further, I get some people may have seen your articles for Haunted Magazine, but perhaps not actually. So do you want to just say a little bit about yourself before we get going anywhere?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Amy Boucher. As I just said, I'm a writer and folklorist, and I specialise between the interplay between history, folklore, and the paranormal, and kind of anything that falls vaguely in those categories. But I focus primarily, almost exclusively to this date, and probably moving forward, on Shropshire, because I found when I started doing this, there was Shropshire was so neglected in the wider corpus of folklore and paranormal and anything about this kind of world. Shropshire was being left out of the discussions.
Yeah.
And Shropshire has some of the most wacky and brilliant and exciting tales you will find. And it's on par with places in Britain that have more of a status in this kind of thing. So I'm really passionate about bringing to light a county that I came from, but also that I love, and I've grown to love even more through my research.
Yeah, exactly. I've said to you just before come on air that there'll be some people that have got probably no idea where Shropshire is. In all honesty, I mean, I know where it is, but actually, and to be honest, obviously, its very location is kind of because it's in that real any kind of borderland territory, and obviously for those that don't realise, Shropshire is on the border of England and Wales. So did you want to say a little bit about the location and what you found out in terms of what's specifically interesting that you find about Shropshire?
Yes, of course. So Shropshire, I'm not a geographer. I'm a history teacher. But vaguely speaking, Shropshire is between Birmingham and the West Midlands and Wales. You've got Wales over here, Birmingham over here, we're slap bang in the middle, and Hereford's underneath us. And Shropshire's really exciting historically because every major period in history Shropshire has a link to. The medieval period, during the medieval period, it was the Marcher territory, and the people that controlled Shropshire, just like places like Cheshire and Herefordshire, they had control essentially over the fate of Britain. Because they were the gateway to England and the gateway to Wales during the wars with the Welsh. If you'd annoyed a Marcher lord, there was nothing stopping a Marcher lord going, you know what, Wales, go on, go and invade England through us. And you've got links with different kings in the medieval period. Henry VIII had a link to Shropshire. He spent some time at Ludlow Castle after he got married. Even, I think, strategically, it was a very, very important area in warfare. So I'll probably mention in a little bit of time about the English Civil War. So a mere week after Charles I had declared he was at war, he was in Shropshire under the foot of the Wrekin, rallying his troops and spending some time in the area. So the King of England is in Shropshire because it's important. And I think one thing that fascinates me is, just like Shropshire has been left out of discussions of the paranormal and folklore, we often forget its history. 1779, Shropshire was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and without some of the developments that happened in Corbet and Iron Bridge, we wouldn't have the things we have today. So it's such a fascinating, exciting era, and I've barely scraped the surface talking about its history just then. Very, very fascinating place, but it's forgotten about. So I'm very passionate about bringing to light this area and our heritage.
I've got to say, I mean, it's like when I've kind of seen your articles as well. I mean, obviously you posted a lot on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, and there's also, I mean, and do you know what strikes me is actually that there's so many quirky little things, you know, folklorist things that, you know, that you write about in terms of for Shropshire, but actually, you know, across the whole of the UK, I mean, there's some very, very odd, quirky, weird kind of little customs and things like that. Did you want to go maybe talk about just some of the quirky, odd things that you've kind of discovered by writing about them?
Of course. So one of my favourite things is the fact that there is a horse-headed ghost that walks around Shropshire. We're not told why. It's in a little village called Hodnett, which is beautiful. And all we're told in life was that he was a farmer and he'd lived an all right life, but he hadn't quite been good enough to go to heaven, and he'd not really been bad enough to go to hell. So he came back as a ghost and he walks around with a horse's head. We're not giving any other context, because why would you want context? It's folklore. Yeah. And there have been a number of sightings of this man since around the Victorian period, maybe middle Victorian period through to about the 40s of this horse-headed ghost. So that's fantastic.
I mean, so you're not things like, it's not like a couple of 100 years old, and this is still, you know, relatively recent kind of reports going on.
Yes. So we have a lot of really well-established stories that have a real historical legacy that kind of move through the different eras and they're still being seen. We also have a lot of traditions that seem to kind of continue in the same historical way. So we've got some death omens and death traditions and funeral traditions that might have died out now, but they were still going on in the 20th century. Yeah. So, for example, in Edgemond, there's a lot of funeral customs, and they do things a little bit differently at funerals in Edgemond, which is in North Shropshire, compared to other areas. So rather than tolling the bell, in that kind of really solemn, solitary tone at a funeral, they ring it in the same way they would celebrate a wedding. Because in Edgemond kind of folklore and Edgemond tradition is that you should be celebrating the fact that this person is being taken to its final resting place, its home. Yeah. So why would you be sad when your loved one is going to be going to God and going to a better place? So you shouldn't be sad about this, you should celebrate this.
Yeah.
And there's evidence of kind of, again, in Edgemond, of people, rather than wearing black, certain people they would wear white to their funerals.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if it's a young person or a unmarried woman, rather than wearing black, you would wear white and a white hood, and have the funeral as more of a celebration than a negative thing necessarily. And that's literally just scratching the surface. There's so many weird and wonderful little customs and little traditions that are prevalent in Shropshire, that have been prevalent from at least the 1700s through to the 20th century. And another great one is sin eating. So sin eating was the idea that, and it's always debated how much actually happened. And it's the idea that when someone died without having last rites, they would get this person known as a sin eater to come into the house, and people tended to stay in their homes until funeral. And the sin eater would eat a ritual meal of bread and alcohol over the person's body, and thus ritually consume the corpse. Not the corpse, that's a bit too far. Ritually consume the sin over the corpse. And this was said to absolve the dead person of any sins. But that sin eater had to carry them for the rest of their life. Right. And there's a reference in the 1700s of this happening in Shropshire. And then it seems to fade away a little bit. And then we get these sporadic mentions of it in the early 1900s. Mm-hmm. We get one mentioned in Market Drayton, we get one mentioned in Oswestry, and we get one mentioned in somewhere else in kind of North Shropshire. But then we have Richard Munslow, who was said to be Shropshire's last sin eater, who was active into the 20th century. And he's very atypical to the kind of traditional sin eater, because the traditional sin eater would tend to be someone at the very fringes of society, very economically struggling, transient peoples, those kind of people who needed the money, and sadly they were willing to pawn their souls for a meal or some finances. But Richard Munslow, he was from a place called Ratchup, or Rattling Hope, the locals call it Ratchup, and he became a sin eater after he experienced really quite profound loss in his family. So he lost 3 of his children in the space of about 3 weeks to illness. And it seems that after that happened, he started traveling around the county and doing this sin eating ritual. And obviously we can only speculate what would make a man resurrect such a practice. But I think it's got to be intrinsically linked to his grief. And it's a conduit. It's a way of exercising his grief. And it's really fascinating to know that even though this subject of sin eating is seen as quite shadowy and people aren't sure how much actually happened, is that it's got to have still been known about in the early middle 19th and early 20th century, because someone resurrected it. And these weren't educated people that were reading lots of books and that might have read about it. These were the same stock that my family come from, farm labourers and working people. So they must have been a prevalence for this kind of tradition. But there's so many brilliant little things in Shropshire, as there are all over the country.
Obviously, like some things you'd expect them to have died out a couple of hundred years ago. I mean, and I know that obviously in the UK, we love our traditions and we love, I mean, there's plenty in Lincolnshire that I know of, and called, there's one nearby called the Haxey Hood, and it's very much paganistic in terms of like these very old traditions that are still prevalent, and I'm sure every county has them. But I mean, is there one which is a centuries-old tradition in Shropshire that still exists today that you actually are particularly fond of, or you particularly like, or you find particularly strange?
So I'll talk about 2 things. The first thing I'll talk about is something that I love that isn't a very old tradition, but has all those characteristics of a pagan kind of festival. So that's the Green Man Festival that happens in Clun every year on May Day. And it's literally like a scene from The Wicker Man. Whenever I've taken people from outside of Shropshire, they have had the moment where they're kind of a bit like, oh no, am I going to end up in a pyre kind of thing?
Just Edward Woodward kind of like, yeah.
Yeah. And that, again, it plays on these ideas of fertility and paganism and new kind of neo-paganism, but it's a very new tradition. It was only really in the 70s that this kind of started. I particularly like sin eating, as I've mentioned. I'm very interested, and I've been doing some research on Shropshire's relationship between troublesome spirits,
Right.
and how Shropshire is has quite a lot of stories where the spirit has been trapped in a bottle. So that has been found outside of Shropshire, and it is quite prevalent elsewhere. But we seem to have a number of stories that kind of all start around the 1770s and go to about 1830, or at least the ones we can date. And it's this idea that this troublesome spirit is in an area, and the only way we can trap it and get rid of it is to put it in a bottle. And some of these spirits, like the roaring bull of Bagbury, are like these giant spiritual bulls that have been awful people in life, and they've come back as an animal.
Yeah.
But there's one in particular that I find really fascinating, because it's could be seen as a comment on so many different things. So it's in a place that's wonderfully called Stanton upon the Heathine, which is kind of North Shropshire, getting towards Shrewsbury and Telford up that way. And there was a lady called Elizabeth Brown, and Elizabeth Brown lived to the grand old age of 92, which is amazing anyway. But in the 1700s, that's even more
unheard of.
Yeah. So in 1777, Elizabeth Brown dies, and she'd been very unconventional in life. She'd been a bit of an eccentric, and the only thing that she wanted and she requested is that she be buried in the woods. She'd spent all her life wandering around these woods, and they were very close to her. They were very important to her. So she asked to be buried in the woods, and the locals agreed. The locals said, you know what, that's a great idea. What a great way to celebrate her life. So they gave her her funeral in the woods. However, shortly after, people started to witness her again walking around the woods as she had done in life, or walking around the fields nearby. Yeah. So this terrified everybody, and they thought, we've made a massive mistake. The vicar was proselytizing about how they've made a mistake, and they thought the only thing they could do is dig up her body, take her somewhere else, and bury her in the churchyard. So they did. It seems in the past there's literally no qualms with digging up dead people. They're doing it all the time. So they dug her up, and they buried her in the churchyard. And this really, really annoyed Elizabeth. This made her fuming, and her spirit came back, and she made herself everyone's problem. So she was said to chase cattle and kick over flowers and different things in the churchyard, and stamp on graves, and sit on a big rock just outside the village, and be absolutely vile to anyone that walks past, and just really insult everyone.
I like the sound of this woman.
She's amazing. Honestly, I love it. But to be honest, they've made the mistake of digging up this woman and turning her spirit from a quiet spirit that's just wandering around the woods to an unquiet spirit with vengeance on her mind.
Yeah.
So the only thing they can think of doing, rather than just go and bury her in the woods again, is they get some of the most notable vicars of the time, some of the most religious and outstandingly religious gentlemen, and they perform a ceremony. And unfortunately, we're not ever told in Shropshire much about this ghost bottle ceremony. But we do know that it takes the form of near constant prayer and candles around the grave or wherever that ghost is haunting. And it's said in Shropshire folklore, and probably elsewhere, that a ghost will try and blow out candles because it's a symbol of their own life force being blown out.
Okay. Yeah.
So when someone's first died, They were supposed to have candles constantly around them, have a plate of salt on their chest, which is said to stop swelling, but also stop evil spirits from coming. And they also were meant to be watched constantly until the funeral. And that's to ensure that no evil spirits took over that person. And there's various other things you do as well, like you cover up the mirrors and you keep an eye out that there's no bees flown into the house, because that's mean you're gaining a ghost. But ghosts will try and blow out candles. So you've got these clergymen in the churchyard surrounded by candles at midnight, battling with this vengeful woman, and eventually they manage to shrink her to the size of a cat, and then shrink her smaller, and then shrink her into the bottle, and they bury her in the bottle in the church. And eventually she was meant to be bottled for 1,000 years. Some accounts it's 100 years, but it's one or the other. But during church renovations in the 1800s, late 1800s, they accidentally unbottle her. So they quickly put the lid on the bottle and bury it in the church right up near the pew, and they've hoped for the best. And we haven't had any records of her coming back, but so they
swearing at
must
people, trampling on graves, nothing like that. Oh,
but,
do you know what? It's those kinds of stories I really love. And there's, I mean, if anybody does, any kind of research into their local area, you will find very, very similar kind of tales to this. I mean, in Lincolnshire, there's one around about, rather than bottles, it's like within cauldrons, within iron cauldrons. They're meant to be contained within an iron cauldron, and they're meant to be buried. And it's a fascinating subject. Before we go on further, obviously what we've done is, obviously you've sent me some pictures of different locations around Shropshire. Like I say, some are just great pictures because they're kind of dark and spooky, and some have a story attached to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the screen. There we go. So let me get rid of this caption a second. There we go. And then we can have a little look. And like I said before we came on, I know of the Iron Bridge in Shropshire, but that's it. That is as all I'm good for, really. So I'm completely in your hands to talk about some of these locations.
Yes. So this is. Can you even see a better view than this? So this is the Stiperstones, and it not only is an area of outstanding natural beauty, it's going to be like a super one soon if they get it right. It's meant to be a really important geological thing, but I don't know anything about geology. And it is the site of my obsession about the devil in Shropshire. So I'll just briefly begin with why I'm obsessed with the devil. Some of you may have heard this before, and then I'll tell you about the Stiperstones. So when I was a child, I was told with grave authority that my granddad had met the devil. It was a story that was shared widely in my family, and I never really questioned it, to be honest, because I was a kid. But it was my introduction to folklore before I even knew what folklore was. So I was told that when my grandfather was a boy, he grew up in Madeley, Ironbridge, around that kind of area. He was in no way interested in church. He didn't care about it. It was a day where he could be out exploring, but he had to be confined to a pew. And it made matters worse because my great-grandmother was a notorious gossip. So an hour and a half at church ended up more like 3 hours. So as you can imagine, it used to annoy him a little bit. And he, one weekend, decided enough was enough when he was probably about 11 or 12 years old. So he spoke to some of his friends and he said, next weekend, we're going to sneak out of church. We're going to play cards. We're going to have a good time. So the next weekend rolled around and they were kind of giving each other sly looks as everyone was going in, and they snuck off. How it worked, I don't know. But they snuck off and it was St. Luke's Church in Ironbridge. So for the people that know, it's the one with those big, like 109 stone steps going up with the covered area. So they snuck out of church, snuck down the steps, and rather than going a little bit further afield. They are kids after all. They just sat at the middle of those stone steps and started playing cards. And all of a sudden, the wind started to pick up and they started to feel really quite uncomfortable. And my grandfather felt a cold hand on his shoulder. And he turned round and told me that he was looking upon the face of Old Scratch, which is a local name for the devil. Now, unfortunately, the fella didn't decide to describe what the devil looked like for me, because obviously he didn't realise I'd be a folklorist, which is a bit selfish, Grandad.
How dare he? Yeah,
how dare he? But he was convinced that it was a person that wasn't from the area. I asked him when I was younger, is this not a local, or was it the vicar, or was it just one of your dad's friends? And he said in no uncertain terms that if it was a local or someone he knew, he'd have been given a clip round the ear and dragged back into church. So he told me that the devil said that if he continued to act in such a way and defy the Sabbath, he would be seeing a lot more of Old Scratch, and eventually he would end up with him. And this is really interesting because it shows an example of the devil as being a moralizer, which on first thoughts you wouldn't necessarily think of. You wouldn't necessarily think that the devil would be an instrument of morality because he's meant to be the antithesis of morality.
Yeah.
But throughout Shropshire folklore, we do see glimpses of this. We do see him playing this role down in Jackfield, which is only about a mile away from the Iron Bridge. The Old Scratch, not my granddad, though he probably did the same too sometimes, but Old Scratch was said to, in 1896, visit the pub one Christmas and start trying to tempt people and all this kind of thing. So it directly shows that if my granddad didn't meet the devil, he was engaging with satanic stories and satanic folklore, and he was making them his own, and that he was in many ways acting like a storyteller. But this started my fascination about the devil in Shropshire, because he's subtly different to many other regions' versions. There are commonalities, but also he's very different to the Christian concept of the devil. And the jewel in Shropshire's satanic crown is the Stiperstones. So this picture is the devil's chair, and just like the name, it's said to be the throne and the seat of Satan's power. So he actually he was the originator of this rock formation. So he was said to be carrying his apron full of rocks from Ireland all the way through Wales to Shropshire, where he was planning to dam the River Severn because he hated Shrewsbury. Lots of stories where a devil or a giant or somebody hates Shrewsbury. But the devil was so annoyed with the town of Shrewsbury, he thought that these great big stones from Ireland would be a great way to dam the River Severn and flood it. Yep. So he's walking and he's got through Wales, but he's starting to ache. He's not as young as he used to be, and he's not as strong. We've all been there. And all of a sudden, his apron strings snap, and these stones come tumbling from his person onto the floor below. And that's why we have the devil's chair. Now, he uses this as a throne in a lot of the folklore, but also he's said to stamp up and down on it in such a fit of rage because he hasn't been able to dam Shrewsbury and flood Shrewsbury, that he's trying to push these stones back to the earth.
Right, okay.
And it's said that if ever life as we know it changes, we need to look to the Stiperstones because the devil has probably pushed them down into the earth and succeeded. As well as that, another sign that the apocalypse is due is that if there are 6 birds that fly around the Stiperstones area and fly around the devil's chair, and they all sing in unison, and it's a beautiful sound, more beautiful than any bird sound you can imagine. But if a 7th bird joins them, they are the 7 whistlers, and that's a sign that the impending doom or the apocalypse or life as we know it is going to change. So already we've got this idea that this rock formation has very evil
Yeah.
stories attached to it. And we know definitively that this rock formation has been linked to the devil since 1595, because there is a Ordnance Survey map that calls this the Devil's Bridge in 1595. So we have a long tradition of this rock formation being seen as satanic or having links to Satan.
Yeah.
And my favorite little bit of folklore attached to it is to do with the winter solstice. So on the winter solstice, the devil is said to sit upon his throne, and he's said to call forth all of the most wicked folk in the county, all the witches and warlocks, and interestingly, in a lot of accounts, it's ghosts too. And he's meant to call them forth to the Stiperstones, and they have the most important black mass of the year. So you've got everyone you could possibly need who's evil is on this area, and they are partaking in black mass. Also, people use this opportunity to make pledges to Satan. If you really want to be one of the who's who of being evil, you would go up to the Stiperstones on this date and pledge yourself to Old Scratch. Finally, when everyone's done with drinking and being merry and being evil, they have a competition where they vote for the most evil and wicked person of the year, and they become the king or queen of evil. It's not really said.
Wow.
It's not really said what they get. If there's a prize, if there's a bonus, a crown, great. But they are known as the king or queen of evil. As well as that, you've got the fact that witches gather up the Stiperstones on every Friday, and they have the equivalent of a business meeting where they all gather together and go, "What evil things have you done? Oh, wonderful!" And it's very, very.
This is it's like a proper hotspot. If you want to be bad or evil, Stiperstones sounds like the place to be to be honest.
Yes, but if you spend a night sitting on the devil's chair, he will either gift you with inspiration or send you mad. And just for anyone that's wondering, with me, I've never done it. But you never know, I would do it for inspiration.
I can imagine it's tempting though.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry, right. Obviously, this is the old bridge, the old iron bridge here. And imagine because of the iron bridge, it must have some tales linked to it as well.
Yes, so wonderful piece of history. This is the bridge I was referring to, and I was saying that it's the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So through the building of this bridge in 1779, Shropshire and Iron Bridge really became the crucible of industry. And a lot of what we have today is because of the Iron Bridge itself. So the Iron Bridge itself is haunted, the actual bridge, by some really quite nice spirits, really. So you've got a lovely, happy couple in Edwardian clothing that are said to wander to the middle of the bridge, have a little kiss, and disappear. I love it.
Oh, that's all right. That's better than the kind of the woman in the church and the
And then you've also got some children that are meant to be seen and heard near the end of the bridge, happily playing and laughing. So again, it's a nice spirits. And then you've got the ghost barge of the River Severn, which is not a nice spirit.
The ghost barge?
Yes, the ghost barge of the River Severn. So this story is actually really interesting because it links so nicely with the history of the area. So, and it actually predates the bridge. So this ghost barge is meant to be best seen on the bank where we actually are in this picture, or on the Iron Bridge itself.
Right.
And it's said to appear quite suddenly, and it's one of those very, very big barges that was used commonly to kind of transport goods to and from places, because prior to the railroads, the River Severn was really the highway of the county. You needed anything moving or bringing goods in or bringing goods out, it was through the River Severn.
Yeah.
So this barge appears and quite suddenly shimmers into view, and you see that it has a very, very inhumanly tall person on the helm of the kind of barge, kind of steering it on its way. And you notice that there's row upon row of things very uniformly, row on row. And when it gets a bit nearer and comes from underneath the bridge or gets a bit nearer to where you stood, you notice that it's got row upon row of corpses on it, which is very shocking, very chilling just to think of seeing this. And just almost as quickly as you realise that it's got this consignment of dead bodies on it, it disappears from view. However, that's not the end of this barge's journey. So if we go back to Jackfield, where I mentioned earlier, the barge is said to reappear near the river's edge.
Yeah.
And the bargeman is said to be stood on the riverbank, staring blankly out at the river. And that row upon row of corpses has now been put on the riverbank. So this is a fascinating story, and even just taking it as it is, it's really cool, and it's very unique to the wider tradition in Britain. I haven't seen many instances of something like this.
I was going to say, I've not heard anything similar. I mean, it sounds very much like that linked to the Industrial Revolution, just because the fact it's barges, and that's how they kind of transported coal and bits and pieces during the Industrial Revolution. And obviously this bridge is very much linked to that. I've never heard anything like that, to be honest, because it sounds like a relatively recent kind of, tale, to be honest.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I have my other granddad. It makes me sound like we're a really weird family, but my other granddad, he witnessed it once coming from a night shift because he worked down in the foundries, because still, even in the 50s and 60s, it was very, very industry boat focused, and he witnessed the ghost barge, and he described exactly as the story suggests. But it's really interesting when you actually start looking at the history of the area outside slightly pre-industrial revolution. So the plague of the 1660s, it decimated England, but in particular, it really hit Shropshire. So Shropshire lost, between, a conservative estimate is usually about 15%, but it's likely to be nearer 18 to 25% of the population were wiped out by the plague. So in small, quite close-knit areas, it would be very hard to find someone that hadn't been affected by this plague. And the only way you could move such a amount of bodies was to put them on a barge, sail them down the River Severn to a plague pit. And interestingly, there are a number of plague pits in Shropshire. So there's one that's supposedly in Shrewsbury on Grope Lane, up one of those shuts. But the nearest plague pit to Iron Bridge was in Jackfield, where the ghost barge is seen as well.
That's
so this
fascinating.
So this could be a number of things. It could be that the ghost of the ghost barge is literally still sailing down the River Severn, and that it is a spirit, it is an entity. But even if you take away from conversations about validity of paranormal experiences, this is a brilliant example about how collective memory becomes a haunting. So you've got an event that is so cataclysmic and that would have touched the lives of everyone who lived through it. And you don't get over something like that. So even when that barge stops sailing down the river, the people that lived through it, the people that lost people, would have continued to see it and experience it and think about their loss. Yeah. And as that loss grew more pertinent and then eventually faded with them passing away, this story became part of folk narratives, which became part of haunting narratives, and that's how we get to where we are today. I believe that a ghost is never just a ghost. I am a believer in the paranormal, but as a folklorist, they are so much more than they're given credit for. And this is such a tangible example of Shropshire's history playing out in its folk narratives. And I think that's why it's such an exciting story to me and to other people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I guess I'm just going to go through a couple of these photos, but you say some of them are just because they look good and they're kind of spooky and things. There's no particular story attached to these gravestones. It's just a good photo.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah. Just a bit spooky.
Enjoy.
Again, that one's just a bit spooky. So that's for people that are local. I know a few people in the chat are local. That's a picture of Eustace Rogers's boathouse, who was the last coracle man in Shropshire, and he actually carried on the tradition of building traditional sort of coracles. He was a good friend of my grandfather's, and when he passed away, there was a worry that that tradition would pass away. But there's been some great work within the Ironbridge Gorge to try and restore this cultural practice. So that's just
this is a great photo. I love the atmosphere of this photo. These so cool. Did you take these photos?
Yes, all the pictures.
These are great. I love that. I love the moon in that photo. Oh, sorry, the skip this one. Okay, Edgemond Village near Newport. So it's a great picture. It looks like, I'm going to guess, it looks like some kind of well.
So that is a well, but it's not directly related to it's more the road it's on.
Okay.
So this is another devil narrative, and it's one of, I always say it's one of my favorite, but then all of them are my favorite because it's the devil. So it's one of my favorite devil narratives. And this road is the road from Edgemond to a place called Ightfield, which is IGHT Field. And it's only a small village, to the point where when I tried to look for heritage photos from around the time, it was very hard to actually find something.
Yeah.
And Ightfield has quite a few devil narratives. It's got one from a story about a fella called Mainwaring, who was said to have clashes with the devil and have these games of wit to see who would gamble to be the best one. And Mainwaring wins, but he has to be buried half in and half out of the church to try and stop the devil catching him. But it's also the story about a encounter between a young boy and a vicar. So this story was collected by Edmund Vale, who was a writer who was operating in the area. It was collected in 1913. So it's relatively recent. I know for some people it wouldn't be, but I'm a medieval history nut. So for me, that's almost like it was last Tuesday. And this vicar was said to have knowledge of the profane arts, and he was said to be in league with the devil. And everyone was kind of unsure about him, but it wasn't until this event happened that we are to really understand his true power. So he had a very naughty and very silly garden boy who worked for him. And he was a bit cheeky. He'd probably be the equivalent of some of my year 8s, just a bit annoying, but no harm in him.
I know them well. I know those kind of kids well. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So it got to the stage where he was being so cheeky and so annoying that the vicar said, right, you've not got a job anymore, get out. So this boy leaves, and he lived in Edgemond, so he had to walk this road to go back home. But before he went home, he was so worried about his mum finding out that he'd lost his job that he started to knock on local houses and see if anyone needed a garden boy or someone to do odd jobs, just something that could facilitate him and his income. He was doing this for a few hours, and it got to maybe 2-3 o'clock, and he was walking down this road, and the vicar who had sacked him was walking the other way. So they met in the middle. So the vicar asked him why he hadn't gone home and what was going on, why are you wandering around the village being annoying? And the young man, the young boy said, oh, it's because I'm trying to find a job. I need to find work. And the vicar smiled and said, you'll never need work where you're going, and carried on his way. At that moment, the young boy drops to the floor and starts convulsing and sweating and being really quite ill. And he has to be taken into a local house, and they have to wait for his parents to pick him up. And for 3 days and 3 nights, he is really unwell. He's sweating, he's convulsing, he's having strange delusions. And he says that there is a black figure standing over his bed, luring over him. And he said that this black figure came when he met the vicar in the street. And unfortunately, if we're to believe the folklore, this young man is said to have died not long after the 3-day mark. But to his dying day, he said that this figure, this entity, whatever you want to call it, that lurched over him was only apparent after he met the vicar that had sacked him. And I think this is a brilliant story. It's tragic, and if there is any grain of truth in it, it's an incredibly tragic story about an unwell young man. But also, it shows us that the devil has a prevalence in life into the 1900s.
Yeah.
And also, quite interestingly, when Victorian farm workers were asked what the devil looked like, quite a few of them would go to describe what a vicar looked like. They would describe someone clad in black, someone who was a bit posher than everyone else, that had airs and graces, and quite often agricultural workers would describe the devil as looking like a vicar. And that's where we get this idea of the man in black, which is carried through into other areas. And it teaches us in a way that sometimes the people that hold positions of power, either moral power or political power or social power, should not be trusted. And I think that this story is a metaphor for that, and it suggests that these people that lived in these communities were savvy enough to know for whatever reason, this man should not be trusted. And I just think it's a really great example of some of the richness of devil folklore in Shropshire.
Absolutely. And like I said, and that whole idea of, the devil being a black figure is prevalent still. Like you say, it's that kind of imagery is still kind of there. Okay, just moving on to this one. Where is this? This looks amazing place.
So this is Moreton Corbet Castle in Shropshire. And it's a later castle. It's kind of like a bit of a pleasure castle more than it being like a castle of defense or anything. And it's a really interesting...
Built to entertain, basically.
Yeah, it's built to entertain. And there was an earlier castle on the site, but it tends to be seen as kind of like it's a cross between a stately home and a castle, really. And it's actually really interesting history, which we probably don't have time for me to history nerd out about, but it pertains to a very, very interesting piece of folklore about a very turbulent time in the kind of history of this area. So Moreton Corbet, for people that don't know, it's in North Shropshire. And rather interestingly, as an aside, it's actually haunted by a multicoloured witch.
Oh, what? Say that again.
A multicoloured witch. So you did hear me right the first time.
I was like, what? I was just trying to get my head around it. Go on, go for it.
So the roads leading up to this castle are said to be haunted by a multicoloured witch who chases cars, and she just clings onto the cars, rides them 3 miles down the road, which is great.
I think you went. Hang on a minute. Well, hang on. Let's go back, because I think you just paused 1 second. The internet lost. A witch clings on to cars as they go down the road. So does it meant to just stay clung to the car? Does it come off at any point?
For about 3 to 5 miles. The most I've ever heard is 5 miles. The least is about 2, which it started. There was a spike in phenomena and reports of it about the 70s. So I don't know whether it was just that we were all having a bit too much
LSD.
Yeah, and magic mushrooms, but still, it's haunting. I love it. Let's go with it. But
that's mental. I just love the. I mean, the 70s multicolored witches. Why not?
Why not? Let's go with it.
And the fact that you carry on driving for 5 miles with a witch on your boat or whatever. Yeah,
but there's actually a really interesting ghost story there as well, which is linked to a completely opposite time in history, the English Civil War, and kind of the religious turbulence that was happening during the English Civil War. It's haunted by a ghost known as Paul Holmyard. and he was a Puritan who had befriended the man who owned Moreton Corbet Castle, who was Sir Vincent Corbet. And they were neighbours, but it's not really clear how they were neighbours. It's not like whether they were like next door or it was 10 miles down the road, but we're told they were neighbours. And they grew this really quite blossoming friendship, really quite a nice kind of bromance, you could say, until the English Civil War, when they started to have difference in opinion because they were both on the opposite sides of the religious spectrum.
Yeah.
Sir Vincent Corbet, it's not clear what religion he had, but he was very pragmatic about the whole situation. And Paul Homeyard was a bit like Howie from The Wicker Man, annoying and very, very religious. Sorry if anyone likes him. And Paul Homeyard had, during this English Civil War, his belongings and his house seized by the officials in the area because he was causing a bit of a stink being so religious. And Corbet felt a bit sorry for him, and he said, you know what, you can come and live with me. And he provided him with a sense of security and gave him a place to stay. However, this made Homeyard become more and more zealous, more and more religious, to the point where it actually was starting to frighten the Corbet family. And he became more and more erratic as well. So it really left Vincent Corbet with no other thing to do really than to kick him out of the house. They had to kick him out and said, look, I know you're my friend, but here's some food. I can't have you staying with me. You're scaring my wife. A normal person would go and maybe find somewhere else to stay, but Paul Homeyard is not a normal person, and he decided to live in the nearby woods. As you do. He carved out a subsistence of sorts, and spent his life eating what he could find and telling the birds and the gnarled trees and anyone that would listen of the treachery that his friend had enacted upon him. And as he grew older, living in the woods isn't probably the best thing one can do. And he began to grow weaker to the point where he knew he needed help. So this bitter, twisted, very religiously zealous Puritan knocks back on the door of his old friend, Vincent Corbet. Vincent Corbet is terrified because it's not only a religious zealot who he kicked out of his house, but he's been living in his woods for years. You know, you would be a bit, this is before the time of ornamental hermits, you would be a bit worried. So Vincent says to Paul, he says, I want no part in this. Please leave my lands, go somewhere else. I want nothing to do with you. And upon doing this, Homeyard utters perhaps one of the best curses I have ever heard in my life. He says, woe unto thee, hard-hearted man. The Lord hath hardened thy heart as he hardened the heart of the Pharaohs to mine own destruction. Rejoice not in thy witches, nor in the monuments of thy pride. For neither thou or thy children, nor thy children's children shall inhabit these walls. They shall be given desolation, snakes and vipers and unclean beasts. They shall make refuge, and thy home shall be filled with doleful creatures. And that's really cool.
I mean, there's a way of, you know, if you're annoyed, that's a great kind of curse, isn't it?
Bring the pharaohs into it, bring some biblical speak. And you can imagine Vincent is stood there at his doorstep, aghast by the situation. He's like, what?
Yeah.
And into the dark, Paul Homeyard leaves, laughing as he went. And in the following morning, Paul Homeyard was found dead. He died. He'd done what he needed to do, cursed the bejesus out of Vincent Homeyard. He's done everything he needs to do. However, this is not the end of his time at Moreton Corbet. Just like Vincent couldn't get rid of him in life, he can't get rid of him in death. And the huddled, ragged figure of Paul Homeyard is seen wandering around the castle grounds, and is hooded and gnarled, and he's seen often lurking around the grounds. there are other figures that have been seen there as well, and other spirits, but Holmyard is the most kind of historically verifiable one. And as well as this, it's interesting because after the English Civil War, there isn't really any time in which the Corbet family ever live at Moreton Corbet again.
Right.
There's
Okay.
sporadic kind of, they might live there for a bit, but there's no prolonged period of time where the Corbet family live at Moreton Corbet Castle, which could suggest that, in fact, this curse has actually come true and it actually was enacted upon them. So I just think it's a really cool story. It's got all the best things about.
That is the best curse I've ever heard, to be honest. I've heard some curses before, but that's a decent one, I've got to say.
That was a doozy.
Right, there's a couple of pictures here. I don't know if it's this of the same location, but
yeah, the Devil's Chair. I just love it.
I say again, great images. What go on? So the Devil's Chairs. That's a great image. I love that.
Thank you.
I did see a post that you put on Twitter the other day about Anne Morgan. Now, I don't know anything about Anne Morgan, but I know that you've linked it to this church in some way, and you said you've done some research and you found something out about it.
Yes.
So you have to tell us about this person called Anne Morgan now.
So my first introduction, as with many people in Shropshire, to Anne Morgan was the idea that she was the Wicked Witch of Much Wenlock. And in Shropshire, we affectionately call anyone who is a little bit older and they're a woman as Nanny, traditionally. So Anne Morgan is known to the folklore as Nanny Morgan. And in folklore, she was said to be the Wicked Witch of the area, who was so wicked and so evil that in life that she was causing all sorts of stink in the area, and she was murdered by her lover, her toy boy lover, I must add.
Of course, why not? Well,
yeah. But because she was so evil, she never rested in life and she never rested in death. And her spirit was said to spend its final moments on Westwood Common, which is up on Wenlock Edge, seducing young men into her servitude. And if any young man gazed upon this spirit, no man could ever call his soul her own, which is cool. You know, it's interesting, but it completely denies the woman that she was. So I've just recently rewritten my whole article about her because there's so much to her story that I've managed to unpick and find out, but I'll give you a brief kind of overview of her life and what we know so far, what I know so far about her as an actual person, because Nanny Morgan was a real person. She lived in the area of Much Wenlock around Boughton and Westwood Common in the late early 1800s. So she was born in Westwood Common, which is like a little area, in 1791. I've managed to find her birth records now, so I can confidently say that that was her date of birth. And she was baptized into the Anglican faith in 1791, little baby in arms, to Richard Williams and Martha Williams, who were a mum and dad. Now, we don't know much about her early life. However, in 1809, she was implicated in a robbery with a girl called Mary Beamund. And this, again, so much of her life does mirror the folklore. However, there are aspects that the folklore completely ignores. So we knew this in the folklore, that she was implicated in this robbery. But I've managed to find the actual transportation records for Mary Beamund. So we know that she actually was part of this trial, and the other girl who was implicated in the robbery was transported to Australia on a ship called the Canada in 1810. And interestingly, Mary Beamund's mum was the last woman in Much Wenlock to do penance wearing a white sheet. So that usually was something that one had to do if they'd been a serial adulterer. So we're getting an idea of the kind of situation that these two young women are growing up in. So Mary's been sent over to Australia, and at the moment her trail goes cold. But Nanny Morgan goes into prison. It's not exactly clear how long she's in prison, but I'm not going to leave that That's my next thing to find out. But when she comes out of prison, she's faced with a very difficult situation. This is the early Victorian period, the early 1800s, and she is a young woman who has committed a crime in a rural area that really has no other options than to go back to her family.
Yeah.
However, she has absolutely disgraced her family by doing this robbery, and her family kick her out. They want nothing to do with her, and no one in the community wants anything to do with her. So she really is a sniff away from the workhouse, which we all know was an awful situation for anyone to go in. However, Much Wenlock, as with a lot of areas in Shropshire, traditionally had a lot of transient people moving through it, particularly members of the travelling community, or even just people that were from other counties that moved through the county to do things like the harvest. And it just so happened that the travelling community and a group of Irish travellers were in the area at the time that Anne Morgan had been kicked out. So she began to talk to these people, and I think they probably understood a little bit of what she was feeling. So they took her in, and she was taken in by the travelling community and given a home. She was given a place to stay, a kind of way of life that really suited her. We have in the newspaper records of a death that she had taken to unchristian behaviour, which one can only imagine what that was, but I'm sure it was
probably
good.
nothing, to be honest.
Yeah. But so she joins this travelling community. She gets taught traditional kind of occult practices, so fortune telling, card reading, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she's really bloody good at it. So she goes off to be unchristian, travelling around Britain, and the trail goes cold for her until one day she unexpectedly turns up in Much Wenlock, and on market day, she knows how to make an entrance. And she tells everyone she's come to take her father's house. She's made her fortune. Her father's passed away, and she's going to take her father's house. So she does, and she quickly sets up a kind of business in the area where she is reading fortunes, cursing, selling charms, traditional kind of rural practices with a bit of an occult flair. And she makes a fortune doing it. Prior to her death, her descendants were said to, or her heir to the financial heir, was said to inherit the equivalent of about 80 to 90,000 pounds today. So she was very successful at it. But it's around this time we start to get a lot of criticisms about her, because she is a relatively young woman who has carved out a path for herself, which is very different to what was expected of a woman in the Victorian times, even in rural societies. So she is started to be stereotyped as the witch. Now, I don't know, and I probably never will know, whether Anne Morgan saw herself as a witch, and I don't think it really matters. The community saw her as one, and as she got older, she started to embody certain characteristics of the witch. She started to dress quite outlandishly, and she started to threaten to curse people. And very, very, very brilliantly, she kept a whole host of animals. She's got cats called Helldew and Satan's Smile, and she's got...
She really didn't give a shit, did she?
She doesn't give a shit. She's playing up to it at this point. And she's got a toad, which she carries around with her all the time, supposedly, who she feeds exclusively on communion wafers, which... Brilliant. I don't know how true it is, but that's not the only reference to toads being fed on communion wafers in Shropshire. So maybe it is, maybe it's part of the toad's diet. And she smothered him with kisses as well, which I love. I
mean, this woman sounds brilliant, to be honest.
She's absolutely amazing. And she ends up having this contradiction that would mark her lifetime, where she is so needed for cursing and love potions and to help old farmers be able to have some time with his lady and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But she's ostracized and ridiculed and kept out of the community. So if she was that much of a terrifying evil witch, why did they go to her for so many different things?
Yeah.
And we really don't get that much more information about her, and apart from she's very successful in what she's doing.
I was going to say, just gonna, sorry, just gonna
No,
butt in
no.
the things, but when you look at other witch trials, you're thinking Pendle Hill and other Pendle witch trials and others. They're usually a couple of 100 years old. We're not normally talking Victorian here, but for me, it sounds that there are so many actual similarities between those witch trials of the 1700s, for instance, 1600s, 1700s, and actually this one,
Yeah.
where it's a woman who's independently minded, from what I can gather, someone who's actually earned and being independent, businesswoman, earned plenty of money, hasn't gone down the traditional route, is doing things her own way, and been completely ostracized for it and labeled a witch.
It's awful, and she must have found a humor to. You don't call your cat Hellblow and Satan Smile if you're not trying to poke fun at the fact you're being
Oh,
called a witch, do you?
she's so doing that on
She's
purpose.
doing it on purpose. And sadly, the remainder of the knowledge we have about Anne Morgan is localized to her death. So in 1857, the 12th of September 1857, Anne Morgan was brutally murdered in her home on Westwood Common. She had a number of injuries. She was stabbed in the face, the neck, the wrist. This wound in her neck cut a carotid artery, which is the main artery that brings the blood to the brain. So it would have been a real bleed. Awful, awful way to die. And she was killed by a young man called William Davis. Now, William Davis moved in with Anne, if we're to believe the newspapers, about 12 months after her husband died. So her husband died in 1856. William moves in and he's there until 1857. William was 35 at the time of Anne's death and Anne was 66. So there's quite an age gap. And he's described like, he's honestly the person that wrote those newspapers. I wouldn't want them to do my CV because they refer to him as a weak, silly, and inoffensive fellow, a silly looking man, thick set and short. They really give him a bit of a character assassination, but not his actual character, more just the way he looks.
Yeah.
But this young man, the newspapers seem to believe that there was some form of romantic relationship between Anne and William. We can't be clear on that. They could have been, lodgers or what have you. But all we do know conclusively, is Anne took him in about within a year of her husband dying. She was the main breadwinner because William was between work, and the two argued quite a lot. And the most kind of plausible reason for her murder I found through reading the different newspaper accounts is the fact that the day that William killed Anne, she had given him some money to go and buy some meat in Much Wenlock for some food that she was going to cook later that day, and William spent it all on alcohol. There was said to be an argument outside where it spilled out into the street and the two were arguing, and then it went back inside. And then in the evening, William stabbed Anne in the injuries I've described and left her for dead. Now, the folklore suggests that no one mourned Anne Morgan. However, we know that rather sadly, her dogs were with her when she was murdered, and they were heard howling after she'd been killed. And her nephew lived nearby. Her nephew was only 10 years old, and her nephew witnessed William leaving the house covered in blood. So he run into the house and he told his mother that he thought his auntie had been killed. And she didn't take it seriously at first until the young boy was hysterical. So they went into the house and they found this incredibly bloody, awful scene. So they got the local police there. The local police focused their efforts on trying to find William. So they left the scene of the crime to go and find him. When they found him, he was dazed and quite confused. And he said, is she really dead, the old lady? I did love her. I did love her. I didn't think I'd done that bad. And he didn't seem to fully grasp, from what I can read into the newspaper accounts, what he'd actually done to Anne. And interestingly, the physician who pronounced Anne dead, who was the first person on the scene of the crime, was actually William Penny Brooks. For people who don't know, he was one of those Victorian men that did everything. He was a botanist and this, that, and the other. But he was also the advocate for things like PE being mandatory, and also the forerunner to the Olympic Games, the Wenlock Games, was actually founded by William Penny Brooks. So we've got this almost celebrity, this important person in British history, turning to the scene of the crime and now pronouncing Anne dead and doing her autopsy as well. So you would think that the local community would be absolutely appalled by this murder, this brutal, awful murder of an older woman by a much younger man.
Yeah.
But in the trial, became this narrative that went beyond cohesion and abuse and what we would now use today. There was this argument used by William's defence that he had murdered Anne to escape a magical thraldom, that she had bewitched him and she had made him his soul hers, and the only way he could escape this is to kill her. And this narrative has been repeated and repeated and repeated into modern books into the 20th century. And it's this idea that her death was warranted for this man to escape this perceived idea of something or other. But by saying this and repeating this narrative, we are excusing a man murdering a woman. We are excusing that abuse, and we're saying that it's okay she died because she was a witch. And I think that's awful now, and it should have been awful then. So eventually, William does get sentenced. He originally gets sentenced to death, but they managed to change this sentence into penal servitude. And the folklore suggests he was deported to Australia, and Anne got her last resort, and she managed to sink the ship. But I've certainly not found any evidence of her sinking the ship. But I think with the way this story makes people feel, you would hope that she had that ability. And sadly, in death, Anne is treated with as much scorn as she was in life. So they couldn't find anyone who was willing to do her last offences and bury her. She was not cleaned. Her body was not prepared. She was buried the same way she was found that night, in her blood-stained clothes, covered in blood, still with one shoe missing. And the folklore was never clear where she was buried. It was suggested in some cases that it was Much Wenlock. Other cases, Moreton was mentioned, which was the church that was up, but it was never clear where she actually was. But one folklore story did suggest she was buried in Moreton. So I have been desperate. I've been researching Anne Morgan for 2 years now, just over 2 years. And I've been desperate to try and find her so we can give her the memory that she deserves, give her back her personhood. And yesterday I was able to conclusively prove that Anne Morgan was buried in Moreton Cemetery in an unmarked grave there, because I found her burial records.
How was that feeling to actually find her?
It was very emotional. I used to work in my previous life before teaching in youth homelessness with victims of domestic abuse and victims of terrible situations. And I couldn't help but think of them when I was writing Anne's story, and I couldn't help but think of her as this powerful, trailblazing woman, but also a victim. So to know that we now know where she's buried, and that we can look into ways in which we can commemorate her, and even something as simple as that I can go to the church and just sit for a moment and think about her, is a wonderful feeling. And it's really strange because my mum is really into churches. We're all a bit weird in my family. My mum's fascination is churches, which is great because of my interests. And we went to Moreton Cemetery, around the 30th, 31st of January, right at the end of last year. And the day had been relatively all right. There hadn't been any weather or anything really. It was one of those kind of nothing days. We got to Moreton, and I mentioned to my mum that this is rumoured where Nanny Morgan was buried. And suddenly this unexpected gust of wind, this gale started to blow up while we were walking around the cemetery. And I just had this overwhelming sense that she was there. And my mum, she's a lot more practical than me. And she says, oh, you're nuts. You don't know where she is. And to know that now I've found where she is, it feels almost like she was trying to give me that message. And, I try and keep as practical as possible, but that was a very profound
I was going to say, I bet that felt pretty powerful. I mean, that must have been powerful stuff for you. You must have probably felt it. Quick message there from Jem saying, are you planning to write a book of your folklore research? If you do, I'll buy it.
Thank you.
So obviously, you spent 2 years researching Anne Morgan, and obviously I know that you'll probably be writing articles and things probably for Haunted Magazine about her and things like that. If you haven't already, you should do. But I mean, are you thinking about writing a book in terms of folklore generally, or about Anne Morgan in particular?
So I am actually writing a book about the satanic folklore in Shropshire at the moment, which is still in its early stages, but I've done the research, I've got the stories, I'm currently writing it. And I've chosen that because it links so much to my audio drama, but also, if we look at the different books that are on the market about Shropshire, there has never been a volume where all the satanic folklore of Shropshire is in one volume. So my goal is to collect it and curate it and present these stories, and also present what they could reference historically. So that is in the pipeline. I would love to bring my research about Anne Morgan into a different format. I've written a blog post about it, but the blog post when I first wrote it was 3,000 words, and now it was 5,000, and now it's nearly 7,000. So there's only so much people will read on the internet.
Yeah.
So I would love to create my research about Anne, as well as some of the other research I've done about witchcraft in general in Shropshire, and bring that into a volume as well. But it'd be really exciting. But hopefully the satanic book will be finished within the year, and I can share it.
See, I think this is. I mean, there's Lola saying I'll definitely be buying a copy of any book you write. I mean, some people, if you talk about the satanic stuff, there are so many. I mean, I'm quite sure people watching this at home, they can probably think of their local area. The number of places which is the devil's pulpit, or the devil's bridge, or the devil's throne, or the devil's hoof mark on the churchyard, on the church door, or the devil's list. It is widespread. I don't know in terms of other countries around, in Europe or in America as well, but it is widespread across the UK that we're obsessed with the devil, it seems, around here.
Yeah. And I think that's why I think, because again, Shropshire's been left out of the narratives about the devil. I really want to present these stories, but also show that there's a tendency to believe that some of these stories about the devil are hundreds and thousands, or like 2,000 years old, when it was pagan and he's a pagan deity. And some of them in Shropshire suggest that. But a lot of these stories are fairly recent. They, in Shropshire, for instance, really mirror a time of industry and the advent of industry. There is a big spike in these stories about the devil being in the area. And it's interesting because the ones that are in Ironbridge and in the Ironbridge Gorge, at one point, Ironbridge, because it was the centre of industry, was known as hell on earth, the bowels of hell, the gates of hell, all these. There's a brilliant picture, Corbet by night, that really demonstrates the glows of industry that never dim. And I think a lot of these stories about the devil and hell and associations with this are a way of dealing with the trauma of the Industrial Revolution, because there's no doubt about it, an agrarian society being thrust into this industrialized world would be traumatic. It would be very different, particularly for the generation that moved from the farms to the foundries. So it's just a really exciting, interesting piece of folklore that has a lot of mirrors to history.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a comment from Amy and Ryan in America. Say we've even got those here, come straight from the colonial Europeans. Yeah, we just spread that message around, don't we?
Yeah. The world needs more Satan.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just aware of time because we have gone like way over like 20 odd minutes and things. Which so thank you first of all, because it has been an absolute pleasure. It's just been absolutely fascinating, the whole thing. I mean, particularly for an area that I know very, very little about, and about the fact that you're so kind of knowledgeable of the whole of Shropshire, it seems. I'm just in awe, to be honest.
Thank you.
But and the fact that I don't know whether you've got like reams of notes in front of you or this is all in your head. I don't know. If it's all in your head, I'm so impressed.
It's all in my head except for Paul Homeyard's curse, which I had to write down because I wanted it to be exact. I wanted to remember it, but my head, I forget what I did last Tuesday. I forget, faces. I forget who the kids are that I teach. Shouldn't say that. But I can remember obscure facts about Shropshire folklore and history. So it's got to have a use.
In fairness, that, first of all, all the folklore is just fascinating, and like I say, if you haven't followed Amy on Twitter, X, whatever, it's down there. So it's Goblin Egg, but the O of Goblin is a 0. Find her, because she you post loads of things around folklore, and there could be little things like items and objects, and it is genuinely really, really fascinating just to hear about folklore from Shropshire, but also just generally of that period that people kind of believe in, have believed in, and thank you, because I will say, and first of all, as well, the other thing is that curse, well worth writing down the word for that curse, because it's awesome.
Yeah.
Best curse I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. So like I said, I don't know if there's any other last little kind of, if there's anybody kind of who's watching at home and you've got any last very, very, very quick kind of little questions for Amy before she's got to go, because we should have wrapped up about half an hour ago, to be honest. So, but hey, it happens sometimes. and I didn't want to interrupt you, Amy, in all honesty. So there you go. It's just people saying how much they love you.
That's really nice.
I think if you did publish a book, you will have no issues in terms of selling it, because I think many people have just been absolutely kind of absorbed by you and just listen to everything you say.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. I don't think there's. I'll give people about another 30 seconds, but I don't think there's many kind of questions coming through. We're just Diane saying we'll just have to get you back
anytime,
and saying how much they love you and saying how fascinating it is. And it's genuine. I've absolutely loved it. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
man.
you for having me.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Like I say, and first, one last thing before we do finish. Is there anything else you want to plug away? Obviously, you got the audio stuff that you've done as well. So did you want to kind of mention that?
So I've written an audio drama about the Stiperstones and the devil folklore around the Stiperstones. The basic premise of it, other than the folklore, which I've kind of mentioned, is what if these ghost hunters that are always talking about the devil actually find the devil? So that's the premise. That can be found on every major streaming program. It's called The Best of Men, and it's made by Alternative Stories and Fake Realities podcast. I've written the first series, which is 2 episodes, and there are going to be another series. That's not good English. There is going to be another series in the pipeline. We're just putting the finishing touches on the script, so hopefully within the year. That's really nice that you've listened to it. Thank you. And I like the Haunted magazine. It's nice that you both come, but it's nice Amy's book Watch This Space, because we're going to keep an eye on it.
And it needs to happen. I think it definitely needs to happen. You've definitely got the talent for it and for all the research you do. I think it has to happen. Sorry, it does. Thank
you.
You've got no
even
choice.
Danny Morgan as well at one point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. We'll leave it there, guys. Like I say, for everybody at home, just, huge thank you to Amy. Absolutely awesome. Please follow her. Please follow exactly what she's doing, because, like I say, and any article she writes in Haunted Magazine, it's going to be good,
Thank
because
you.
this whole
Thank
podcast
you.
has been absolutely awesome. So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Amy.
Thanks.
Right. We'll leave it there. So I shall. For next week, ready for next week? I don't have a guest yet. So if you are, I'm going to be contacting various different people over this next week or so to kind of fill in different booking slots for the 4 different new guests. So if you want to come on, let me know on Twitter, right, at Paranormal Monk, and get hold of me. Otherwise, I will be contacting various different contacts that I have to get some of you guys on here to chat all things ghosts and paranormal. But yeah, I shall be back next Monday. And if I don't have a guest, then it'll just be me. You'll have to just cope with me. Sorry. But there we go. So yeah, back on Monday, next Monday. Thank you again to Amy. Been absolutely amazing, absolutely incredible. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Right, we shall leave it there. Right, thank you guys. Good night, and I shall see you next Monday. Bye-bye.